The doctors screamed. Security lunged forward. A billionaire's heart stopped beating. And a 12-year-old boy with duct tape holding his sneakers together dropped to his knees on a marble floor that cost more than every meal he'd ever eaten combined. In his hand, a dirty purple plastic cup. In front of him, a baby, turning blue in a bright red onesie. Behind him, 17 medical professionals with a combined century of training, frozen in terror, screaming at him to stop. He didn't stop. Because on the streets of Chicago, you don't wait for permission to save a life. You don't ask for protocols. You don't check with lawyers or liability teams or hospital administrators. You act, or someone dies. The water left the cup, and in that single, impossible moment, everything changed. What you're about to see will make you question everything you believe about heroes, medicine, and who really deserves to be saved. Before we dive into what happens next, drop a comment below. What time is it where you are? And what city are you watching from? I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. It wasn't dramatic at first. There was no alarm, no crash of equipment, no shouting or running or any of the chaos you'd expect when death walks into a room. There was just silence. Arthur Vance stood in the lobby of Mercy One Medical Center, the most exclusive private hospital in Chicago. A glass tower of wealth and privilege, rising 40 stories above a city that held both penthouse dreams and cardboard box nightmares. He owned 3 floors of this building. His name was etched in bronze above the cardiac wing. His money had purchased the MRI machine that hummed somewhere in the basement. His 7-month-old son, Noah, was cradled in his arms, dressed in a bright red onesie, giggling at the crystal chandelier that scattered light across the marble floor like scattered diamonds. 1 second, Noah was laughing. The next second, he wasn't. His tiny body went rigid. His back arched like a bow pulled too tight. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. No cry, no whimper, no breath. His face shifted from pink to pale to something closer to gray. And Arthur Vance, a man who had conquered boardrooms and bankrupted competitors and never once felt powerless in his 53 years of life, felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. "Help," he whispered, then screamed it. "Help! Somebody help my son!" And across the lobby, hiding behind a marble pillar where the heating vents blew warm air onto frozen fingers, a boy named Leo watched the chaos unfold. Who deserves to be a hero? The wind off Lake Michigan could kill you if you let it. Leo knew this the way he knew most things, not from books or teachers or parents who sat you down and explained how the world worked. He knew it from experience. From the night he watched a man freeze to death behind the Walgreens on State Street, curled up against a dumpster like he was just taking a nap. Except the nap never ended, and the ambulance that came didn't bother turning on its sirens. 12 years old, that's how old Leo was when he learned that cold wasn't just uncomfortable, cold was a predator. And in Chicago, in January, with the wind chill dropping temperatures to 15 below zero, that predator was hunting. So when Leo spotted the revolving glass doors of Mercy One Medical Center pushing warm air out onto the sidewalk every time some rich person walked through, he did what any survivor would do. He got closer. Not inside. Never inside. Leo had learned that lesson too, the hard way, when a security guard at the Magnificent Mile shopping center had grabbed him by the collar and thrown him back into the snow like he was trash that had blown in by accident. Places like this weren't for people like him. The marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the women in fur coats and men in suits that cost more than Leo's mother had made in a year before she disappeared, none of it was meant for a black boy with soot on his cheek and duct tape holding his gray sneakers together. But the heat didn't know the difference between rich and poor. The heat just radiated outward, and if Leo pressed himself against the marble pillar just to the left of the entrance, if he made himself small and invisible the way he'd learned to do in shelters and soup kitchens and the back corners of public libraries, he could steal a few minutes of warmth before someone noticed and chased him away. He'd been stealing warmth for almost 20 minutes now. long enough to watch the parade of wealth flow in and out of the building, long enough to catalog the details that fascinated and horrified him in equal measure. A woman with diamonds dripping from her ears, complaining into her phone about her Pilates instructor. A man in a cashmere coat, barking orders at someone about stock prices while his assistant scrambled to keep up. A couple who looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine cover, laughing about their ski trip to Aspen while their driver waited outside in a black Mercedes that probably cost more than the shelter where Leo sometimes slept. None of them saw him. That was the thing about being poor. You became invisible. Not metaphorically, not poetically, literally invisible. Like you existed in a different dimension that rich people couldn't perceive. Their eyes slid right over you, the same way they slid over fire hydrants and parking meters and all the other objects that cluttered up their path to wherever they were going. Leo had stopped being hurt by it years ago. Now he just used it. Invisibility was a survival skill, same as knowing which restaurant dumpsters had the best food and which cops would let you sleep in the park and which shelters had beds available on the coldest nights. He pressed himself tighter against the pillar, feeling the warmth seep into his bones, and watched the show. That's when the black Escalade pulled up. It was different from the other luxury vehicles that had come and gone, bigger, sleeker, with windows tinted so dark they looked like polished obsidian. The driver leaped out first, rushing around to open the back door with the kind of urgency that suggested whoever was inside didn't like to wait for anything. A man emerged. Leo recognized the type immediately, the suit that fit too perfectly to be anything but custom-made, the watch that caught the winter light and threw it back like a challenge, the posture of someone who had never once in his life been told no and meant it. But there was something else too, something that made Leo look twice. The man was carrying a baby. Not the way most men carried babies awkwardly, at arm's length, like they were handling something fragile and foreign. This man held the child close to his chest, protective, almost desperate, like the baby was the most precious thing in the universe and he was terrified of dropping it. The baby was dressed in a bright red onesie that stood out against the gray Chicago winter like a drop of blood on snow. It was laughing. Leo could hear the sound even from 20 feet away. That pure, bubbling joy that only babies could produce, uncorrupted by everything the world would eventually teach them about pain and disappointment and loss. The man smiled at the baby. A real smile, not the performative kind Leo saw on rich people's faces when they were being photographed for charity events. This smile transformed his face, softened all the hard edges of wealth and power into something almost human. "Let's get you checked out, little man," the man said, his voice carrying across the cold air. "Just a routine visit, in and out. Then we'll go home and watch the game, yeah?" The baby gurgled in response, reaching up to grab at the man's chin. Leo watched them disappear through the revolving doors, and something twisted in his chest. Not jealousy, exactly. He'd moved past jealousy a long time ago. It was a useless emotion when you were too busy surviving to waste energy on wanting things you could never have. But something, a memory, maybe, of being small enough to be carried, of having someone who looked at you like you were the most precious thing in the universe. He shook it off. Memories were dangerous. Memories made you soft, made you slow, made you forget that the wind was still blowing and the cold was still hunting, and you were still invisible and alone. Leo pulled his thin hoodie tighter around his shoulders and settled back against the pillar. Just a few more minutes of warmth. That's all he needed. Then he'd move on, find somewhere else to exist until the sun went down and the real cold came, and he had to figure out where to sleep tonight. Just a few more minutes. Inside Mercy One Medical Center, Arthur Vance stepped into a world that had been designed specifically for people like him. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth, 40-foot ceilings, Italian marble floors polished to a mirror shine, a crystal chandelier that had been imported from some Austrian castle and probably cost more than most people's houses. Original artwork lined the walls. A grand piano sat in the corner, playing itself through some invisible mechanical system, filling the space with soft classical music that was meant to soothe and impress in equal measure. This wasn't a hospital. This was a temple, and the god it worshipped was money. Arthur barely noticed any of it. He'd grown up in places like this, had spent his entire life surrounded by the kind of luxury that most people only saw in movies. The marble, the chandeliers, the art, it was all just background noise, the default setting of his existence. What he noticed, what consumed his entire attention, was the 7-month-old miracle in his arms. Noah Ezra Vance, born premature at 32 weeks, spending his first month of life in a NICU that Arthur had personally funded after his wife's difficult pregnancy. Every specialist in the country had been consulted. Every possible intervention had been deployed. And against odds that the doctors had quoted as concerning, Noah had survived, thrived even, grown into a healthy, happy baby who laughed at ceiling fans and grabbed at everything within reach and had somehow become the center of Arthur's entire universe. Arthur hadn't expected fatherhood to change him. He was 53 years old, had built a real estate empire that spanned 3 continents, had been married twice before, and never felt the pull toward children that other men described. But then Celeste had gotten pregnant, and Noah had arrived early, and Arthur had stood in that NICU watching his son fight for every breath, and something inside him had cracked open. Now he couldn't imagine life without this small, squirming, laughing creature. Couldn't imagine caring about stock prices or board meetings or any of the things that had consumed him for decades. Noah had rewired his brain, reprogrammed his priorities, made him feel something he hadn't felt since he was a child himself. Vulnerable. Mr. Vance, welcome back. The receptionist, a polished woman in her 40s, who probably made more than most doctors at regular hospitals, rose from behind her desk with a practiced smile. Doctor, Okonkwo is ready for you in the pediatric suite. Shall I have someone escort you? I know the way, Philippa. Thank you. Arthur crossed the lobby, Noah babbling happily against his chest, reaching for the light that scattered from the chandelier. The baby's fascination with shiny things was endless. Arthur had already caught him trying to eat his cufflinks twice. Look at that, buddy, Arthur murmured, tilting Noah so he could see the chandelier better. Pretty, right? That's Swarovski crystal, Austrian, probably worth more than some people's in furs. He stopped himself. Celeste would have smacked him for that. She was always reminding him to be more aware, more conscious of the bubble they lived in. Noah doesn't need to learn that money is the measure of everything, she'd said just last week. He needs to learn that people matter, all people, not just the ones who can afford a seat at our table. Arthur had nodded and agreed and immediately forgotten, because that was the thing about wealth. It insulated you so completely that you stopped seeing the insulation at all. He was halfway across the lobby when it happened. Noah had been reaching for the light, giggling, his small body warm and alive against Arthur's chest. Then, without warning, silence. The giggling stopped. The reaching stopped. Noah's entire body went rigid, his back arching with sudden violence, his mouth opening in a silent scream that produced no sound at all. Arthur froze. Noah? Noah! The baby's face was changing color. Pink fading to pale. Pale shifting toward gray. His eyes were open but unseeing, fixed on something beyond the chandelier, beyond the ceiling, beyond anything in this world. He wasn't breathing. Arthur's son wasn't breathing. Help! The word tore out of Arthur's throat with a force that surprised even him. Somebody help! My son isn't breathing. The cathedral of wealth erupted into chaos. Staff members rushed from every direction. Alarms began to sound. Somewhere, someone was shouting medical terminology that Arthur couldn't process. But all he could see was Noah's face, turning blue. And outside, pressed against a marble pillar, stealing warmth from the rich, a boy named Leo heard the screaming and saw something that made his blood run cold. He'd seen that color before, that terrible, deathly blue. He knew what it meant. And he knew something else too. Something the doctors rushing toward the billionaire didn't know. Something you only learned on the streets, in the shelters, in the dark corners of a city that had taught Leo everything about survival and nothing about hope. He knew how to fix it. The question was whether he was brave enough to try, transformed into something primal and desperate. The soft piano music still played some cruel algorithmic oversight that no one thought to silence while staff members sprinted across the polished stone, their expensive shoes slapping against marble that had been imported from quarries in Carrara, Italy. Dr. Adeze Okonkwo was the first physician to reach them. She was 47, Nigerian-born, trained at Johns Hopkins in Oxford, with 30 years of experience that had prepared her for almost everything. Almost. "Put him down," she commanded, her voice cutting through the chaos. Gently, on his back. Arthur's hands were shaking so badly he could barely comply. He lowered Noah to the marble floor, this floor that wealthy patients praised for its elegance, that architects had designed to impress, that now served as a cold, hard bed for a baby fighting to breathe. The red onesie looked obscene against all that white marble, a splash of blood on snow, a child-sized emergency in a building designed for adult-sized checkbooks. He just stopped. Arthur heard himself saying, the words tumbling out, disconnected from any conscious thought. He was laughing. He was reaching for the light. And then he just stopped. "Sir, I need you to step back. That's my son. That's my son. Sir." Dr. Okonkwo's voice hardened. "Step back." Two nurses physically moved Arthur away from Noah's tiny body. He didn't resist, couldn't resist. His legs had stopped working properly. His entire body had become a prison of terror and helplessness. This couldn't be happening. Not to Noah. Not to the miracle baby who had survived a month in the NICU, who had beaten every odd the doctors had given him, who was supposed to grow up and inherit everything Arthur had built and continue the Vance legacy for another generation. Not like this. Please, God, not like this. More medical staff arrived. 4 doctors now, 6 nurses, a respiratory specialist who had been paged from the 3rd floor, a pediatric emergency team that materialized from somewhere with a crash cart and equipment that beeped and flashed with urgent importance. They surrounded Noah in a circle of white coats and blue scrubs, blocking Arthur's view, their bodies forming a wall between father and son. And then, nothing. That was the thing that would haunt Arthur for years afterward. The nothing. The paralysis. The way 17 trained medical professionals stood around his dying son and seemed to freeze. "We need to assess the airway. Someone get the laryngoscope. What's his baseline? Do we have records?" "Page Dr. Fitzgerald. He's the specialist for..." "Should we intubate? What's the protocol for..." Wait, don't touch him yet. We need to document." Words. Endless words. Medical terminology bouncing back and forth like a tennis match while Noah's face continued its terrible journey from gray toward blue. Arthur's terror crystallized into rage. "Why aren't you helping him?" His voice echoed off the marble walls, the vaulted ceiling, the crystal chandelier that kept scattering light across the scene like this was some kind of elegant nightmare. Every head turned toward him. The staff, the other patients in the lobby, the security guards who had moved closer in case the screaming billionaire became a problem. "Mr. Vance, doctor," Okonkwo said carefully, "we need to follow proper protocols. Your son appears to be experiencing some form of laryngospasm or breath-holding spell. These conditions require careful..." "He's not breathing. Just do something." "Sir, if we act without proper assessment, we could cause more harm. We need to..." He's turning blue. Arthur lunged forward, trying to push through the wall of medical staff, trying to reach his son. Security guards intercepted him, their hands firm on his shoulders, holding him back while his child lay dying 15 feet away. Dying. The word hit Arthur like a physical blow. His son was dying. Right here, right now, on a marble floor that cost $40,000 to install, surrounded by doctors who charged $500 an hour, in a hospital that bore his family's name on the cardiac wing. All his money, all his power, all his influence and connections and resources. None of it mattered. None of it could make these doctors move faster, act decisively, save the only thing in the world that Arthur truly cared about. He stopped struggling against the security guards. His legs gave out. He would have collapsed entirely if they hadn't been holding him up. "Please," he whispered, all the rage draining out of him, leaving nothing but naked desperation. "Please. He's my son. He's all I have. Please." Dr. Okonkwo turned back to Noah. She was holding a small flashlight, shining it into the baby's mouth, checking the airway. Behind her, a nurse was preparing an intubation tray. Another was setting up monitors. A third was documenting everything on a tablet because even in emergencies, especially in hospitals that catered to billionaires, documentation was essential. Liability, protocols, procedures. The system that was supposed to save lives had become a machine that processed them instead. "His airway appears clear," Dr. Okonkwo announced, "but he's still not breathing spontaneously. We may be looking at a neurological event rather than a simple obstruction. Should we call neurology? Get Dr. Abramowitz on the line and prep for a possible... What about the parents? Should we move them to a... His O2 stats are dropping. We need to make a decision. Wait. Has anyone confirmed consent for invasive procedures? The liability on a case like this." Arthur wanted to scream, wanted to grab every single one of them and shake them until they stopped talking and started doing. His son was dying, and they were worried about consent forms and liability and protocols. 23 seconds had passed since Noah stopped breathing. 23 seconds of chaos that accomplished nothing. 23 seconds closer to brain damage, organ failure, death. And outside the wall of medical staff, invisible to everyone focused on the emergency, a 12-year-old boy with duct tape on his sneakers was watching with recognition in his eyes. Leo had seen this before. Not in a hospital. Never in a place like this, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers and doctors who probably made more in a week than Leo would see in a lifetime. He'd seen it in the shelters. In the overcrowded rooms where desperate mothers tried to keep their babies warm and safe while the system that was supposed to help them failed over and over again. He'd seen it when Mrs. Patterson's baby stopped breathing in the middle of the night at the Salvation Army shelter on Madison Street. When the staff panicked and called 911 and the ambulance took 23 minutes to arrive because emergencies in poor neighborhoods didn't get the same priority as emergencies in rich ones. 23 minutes. That baby would have died 10 times over if they'd waited. But Mrs. Patterson hadn't waited. Mrs. Patterson was 67 years old and had raised 9 children and 17 grandchildren in the Mississippi Delta before circumstances Leo never fully understood brought her to a Chicago homeless shelter. She knew things that doctors didn't know. Old things. Practical things. Things that had been passed down through generations of women who couldn't afford hospitals and had to figure out how to save their children anyway. "Babies locked up, Mrs." Patterson had said, her voice calm despite the chaos around her. "Happens sometimes when they get scared or overstimulated. Body forgets how to breathe. You gotta remind it." Then she'd grabbed a cup of cold water from the drinking fountain and splashed it on the baby's face. The baby had gasped, coughed, started crying with the kind of fury that only a very alive, very angry infant could produce. "Cold shock, Mrs." Patterson had explained later, after the ambulance finally arrived, and the paramedics confirmed that the baby was fine. Resets the system, like rebooting a computer. Except, it's a baby. Leo had never forgotten that, had filed it away in the part of his brain where he kept all the survival knowledge he'd accumulated over years of living on the margins, which dumpsters had food, which cops were dangerous, which shelters had beds, and how to save a baby who had forgotten how to breathe. Now, pressed against the marble pillar, watching through the gaps between expensive suits and white coats, Leo saw the same thing happening again. The baby in the red onesie, the face turning blue, the body locked rigid, caught in some terrible loop that the nervous system couldn't escape. And the doctors doing nothing, talking instead of acting, following protocols that had been designed for normal situations, not for the handful of seconds that separated life from death. Leo's heart was pounding. His palms were sweating despite the cold. Every instinct he'd developed over years of being invisible was screaming at him to stay hidden, stay quiet, stay out of sight. If he stepped forward, they would see him. The security guards, who had already glanced his way twice, suspicious of the dirty boy hovering near the entrance. The doctors, who would assume he was trying to steal something. The billionaire, who would look at his taped-up sneakers and soot-stained face and see nothing but threat. He would be arrested. Definitely. Maybe worse. The system didn't treat black boys from the streets with anything resembling kindness, and Leo had the scars to prove it. But if he stayed hidden, the baby would die. Leo watched the infant's face shift another shade toward blue. Watched the doctors continue their endless discussion of protocols and procedures. Watched the father, the billionaire in the expensive suit, collapse against the security guards holding him back, his face a mask of helpless despair. 31 seconds now. Maybe 32. How long could a baby survive without oxygen? Leo didn't know exactly, but he knew it wasn't long. And he knew that every second these doctors spent talking was a second that baby's brain was starving. The water cooler was 15 feet away. One of those fancy ones with the blue LED lights and the digital temperature display. Probably filtered 17 times and blessed by some wellness guru. Beside it, in a trash can, Leo spotted a purple plastic cup, discarded by some wealthy patient who couldn't be bothered to find a recycling bin. 15 feet to the water cooler. 20 feet from there to the baby. 35 feet between Leo and the decision that would change his life forever. He thought about Mrs. Patterson, about the way she'd moved without hesitation, without permission, without caring what anyone thought. She'd just seen a problem and fixed it, because that's what you did when lives were at stake. He thought about his mother, wherever she was, whatever had happened to her. She'd always told him he was meant for something more than survival. Something bigger. Something that mattered. "You got a good heart, Leo," she'd said, the last time he saw her. "Don't let this world take that from you." 34 seconds. The baby's lips were blue now. Fully, completely blue. Leo moved. He didn't make a conscious decision. His body simply responded to something deeper than thought, deeper than fear, deeper than the survival instincts that had kept him alive on these cruel streets. He moved, and everything that came next happened very, very fast. Leo just made his choice like an ocean, and every step he took sent ripples through the room that he could feel even if no one else noticed yet. The water cooler first. That was the target. That fancy machine with its glowing blue lights and digital display showing the temperature in both Fahrenheit and Celsius, because rich people apparently needed options, even for their water. 12 steps. Leo counted them without meaning to, the way he counted everything. Exits in a room, coins in a tip jar, days since his last real meal. Counting was survival. Counting kept you sharp. The purple plastic cup sat in the trash can beside the cooler, crumpled but intact. Some wealthy woman had probably used it once, taken 2 sips of water, and tossed it away without a second thought. Waste meant nothing to people who had never known want. Leo grabbed the cup, straightened it with fingers that were steadier than they had any right to be. The water came out ice cold. The digital display read 34 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing, the kind of temperature that made your teeth ache and your throat constrict. Perfect. Behind him, the chaos continued. The doctors were still talking, still debating, still following protocols that had been written by lawyers and administrators who had never watched a baby turn blue. Possible seizure activity. We should consider, but without a proper neurological baseline. Liability concerns if we proceed without. 41 seconds, maybe 42. Leo had lost count somewhere between the pillar and the water cooler, but he knew they were running out of time. The baby's brain was running out of time. He turned toward the circle of white coats and blue scrubs. 20 feet. That's all that separated him from the baby in the red onesie. 20 feet of marble floor and medical professionals and security guards and every obstacle the universe could throw between a homeless black boy and a billionaire's dying son. Leo started walking. No, not walking. Walking was too slow, too hesitant, too easy to stop. Leo was moving with the kind of desperate purpose that he'd only felt a handful of times in his life when the cops were chasing him through the alley behind the bodega, when the older boys at the shelter tried to take his shoes, When the social worker came to the apartment and his mother whispered for him to hide in the closet and not make a sound no matter what. Survival mode. That's what this was. Except this time, he wasn't trying to survive. He was trying to save. Right now, someone watching this is thinking about clicking away. Don't. I'm begging you. What happens in the next 60 seconds will stay with you forever. Keep watching. And if this story matters to you, subscribe, because stories like this only spread when people like you share them. The first person to notice Leo was a nurse named Constance. She was standing at the edge of the medical circle, holding a tablet, documenting everything for the inevitable legal review that would follow this emergency, regardless of outcome. Her job wasn't to treat the patient. Her job was to record, to witness, to create a paper trail that would protect the hospital from liability. She looked up from her screen and saw a boy. A black boy. 12, maybe 13. Dirty hoodie, torn jeans, sneakers held together with duct tape. Face smudged with something dark, soot or dirt or the general grime of street life. Moving toward them with a purple plastic cup in his hand and an expression that Constance couldn't quite read. Determination? Desperation? Something else entirely? Security, she said, her voice cutting through the medical chatter. Security. 2 guards responded instantly. They'd been watching the perimeter of the emergency, keeping the gathering crowd of wealthy patients and staff at a safe distance. Now they pivoted toward the new threat, because that's what Leo was to them. A threat. An intruder. A problem to be solved. Hey, stop right there. Leo didn't stop. Kid, I said stop! Leo kept moving. The guards were faster than him, bigger, stronger, trained for exactly this kind of situation. They closed the distance in seconds, their hands reaching for Leo's hoodie, his arms, anything they could grab to halt his progress. But Leo had spent years learning how to move through spaces that didn't want him, how to slip between bodies in a crowded shelter, how to dodge security at the mall when the weather turned cold, how to be quick and small and impossible to catch when catching him meant pain. He ducked under the first guard's grasp, twisted away from the second, lost his balance for a moment, but kept his feet, kept the cup, kept moving toward the baby, who was now less than 10 feet away. Grab him. What the hell? Someone get that kid. The medical circle broke apart in confusion. Doctors stumbled backward, startled by the sudden chaos. Nurses dropped equipment. Doctor. Okonkwo looked up from the baby's airway, her face shifting from concentration to shock to anger in the space of a heartbeat. Security! Get him out of here! Who let him in? Is that a homeless kid? How did a homeless kid get in here? The voices blended together into a wall of outrage and confusion. These people had never seen anything like this, had never had their pristine, controlled environment invaded by someone so clearly from a different world. Leo didn't care about their outrage, didn't care about their confusion, didn't care about anything except the baby lying on the marble floor, the baby whose face had gone from blue to something darker, something that meant they had seconds left instead of minutes. He dropped to his knees. The marble was cold and hard, sending a shock of pain through his kneecaps that he barely registered. His slide carried him the last few feet, bringing him to a stop right beside Noah's tiny, rigid body. The red onesie, the blue face, the open mouth that was trying so hard to breathe but couldn't remember how. Get him away from the baby. Don't touch him. Security. Hands grabbed at Leo's hoodie. Fingers closed around his arm. Someone was shouting directly into his ear, their voice a meaningless roar of anger and fear. Leo ignored all of it. He raised the purple plastic cup. For one frozen moment, everything stopped. The guards paused mid-grab. The doctors fell silent. Even Arthur Vance, still held back by security, stopped struggling and stared at the impossible scene unfolding in front of him. A homeless boy. A plastic cup. A billionaire's baby. Then Leo tilted the cup, and ice-cold water cascaded onto Noah's face. The splash seemed to happen in slow motion. Leo watched the water leave the cup in a crystalline arc, catching the light from the chandelier, scattering into 1,000 tiny droplets that sparkled like diamonds before landing on the baby's blue lips. His pale cheeks, his unseeing eyes. Cold shock. That's what Mrs. Patterson had called it. The body's response to sudden temperature change, a reset button built into human physiology, designed by evolution to restart systems that had locked up. For one terrible heartbeat, nothing happened. Noah lay there, motionless, water dripping down his face onto the marble floor. The blue hadn't changed. The rigidity hadn't broken. Leo felt his heart stop, felt the certainty that he'd been wrong, that Mrs. Patterson's trick only worked sometimes, and this wasn't one of those times. And he'd just assaulted a billionaire's baby, and now he was going to jail, or worse, and the baby was still going to die anyway. Then Noah gasped. It was the most beautiful sound Leo had ever heard. A raw, ragged intake of breath that seemed to pull air from the entire lobby. The baby's back arched, but differently this time. Not the rigid lock of a body forgetting how to function, the arch of a body remembering. The blue faded. Color flooded back into Noah's cheeks. His eyes, which had been fixed on nothing, suddenly focused on the chandelier above him, on the light he'd been reaching for before everything went wrong. And then Noah started to cry. Not a weak, pathetic whimper. A full-throated, furious scream. The cry of a baby who had been somewhere dark and scary, and was now back in a world that was too bright, and too cold, and too overwhelming. The cry of a baby who was alive. The lobby went silent. 17 medical professionals, 4 security guards, 1 billionaire, and a 12-year-old boy with a purple plastic cup, all frozen in a tableau that none of them fully understood. Leo stayed on his knees, the empty cup still in his hand, water dripping from his fingers onto the marble. He was shaking now, the adrenaline that had carried him this far suddenly draining away, leaving nothing but exhaustion and fear. What had he done? What was going to happen now? Dr. Okonkwo was the first to move. She dropped to her knees beside Noah, her fingers finding his pulse, her eyes scanning his face with a clinical precision that had finally found something useful to analyze. "His airway is open," she said, her voice strange and hollow. "Breathing is regular. Color is returning to normal. Pulse is strong." She looked up at Leo. Her expression was impossible to read. Shock, certainly, but something else too. Something that might have been wonder, or might have been the first stirrings of understanding. "What did you do?" she whispered. Leo opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, hands closed around his arms and yanked him backward. "Got him. Don't let him get away. Call the police. This kid just assaulted a patient." The security guards lifted Leo to his feet, their grips tight enough to bruise. One of them was already reaching for handcuffs. The other was speaking into a radio, calling for backup, for police, for whatever authority would take this problem off their hands. Leo didn't struggle, didn't try to run. What was the point? He'd done what he came to do. The baby was breathing. The baby was crying. The baby was alive. Whatever happened next, at least he'd done something that mattered. He closed his eyes and waited for the consequences to begin. But then a voice cut through the chaos. A voice that carried the weight of money and power and absolute authority. A voice that Leo had only heard once before, screaming for someone to help his son. "Let him go." Leo opened his eyes. Arthur Vance was walking toward them. The security guards who had been holding him back had released him. And now he moved across the marble floor with the focused intensity of a man who had just watched his entire world collapse and rebuild in the space of 90 seconds. His suit was ruined. Somewhere in the chaos, he'd fallen to his knees, and the expensive fabric was stained with whatever had been on the floor. His hair was disheveled. His eyes were red. But his voice was steady. "I said let him." Those arms, fingers digging into the thin fabric of his hoodie hard enough to leave marks. They were trained to follow protocols, to neutralize threats, to protect the wealthy patients who paid premium prices for the privilege of never having to encounter people like Leo. A billionaire's verbal command wasn't enough to override years of conditioning. "Sir, this individual trespassed into a medical emergency and made physical contact with your son," the larger guard said, his voice carrying the rehearsed calm of someone who had delivered this speech many times before. "We need to detain him until police arrive, for your safety and the safety of quote." I said, "Let him go." Arthur's voice hadn't risen, hadn't taken on the sharp edge of anger that Leo had heard earlier when he was screaming at the doctors to help his son. This was something different, something colder. The voice of a man who had spent 30 years commanding boardrooms and negotiating billion-dollar deals and never once being told no by anyone who wanted to keep their job. "Sir, do you know who I am?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Of course they knew who he was. Everyone in this building knew who Arthur Vance was. His name was on the cardiac wing. His money funded half the research programs. His annual donations kept the lights on in departments that insurance companies had deemed unprofitable. "Yes, sir. But protocol requires." "Protocol." Arthur let out a sound that might have been a laugh if it had any humor in it. "Protocol. Your protocols had 17 medical professionals standing around my son while he turned blue. Your protocols had doctors checking monitors and calling for equipment while my baby stopped breathing. Your protocols almost killed my child." He pointed at Leo. "That boy saved him with a plastic cup and 5 seconds of action, while your protocols accomplished nothing." The guards exchanged glances. The situation had shifted in ways their training hadn't prepared them for. They were still holding Leo, but their grips had loosened slightly, uncertainty creeping into their professional composure. Dr. Okonkwo stepped forward. She was still kneeling beside Noah, who had stopped crying and was now making the soft, hiccuping sounds of a baby recovering from a very bad experience. Her face was a complicated map of emotions, professional pride warring with the undeniable reality of what had just happened. "Mr. Vance, I understand you're upset, but we need to assess what occurred here. The boy poured water on your son's face without any medical justification. The fact that Noah recovered could be coincidental. We can't simply—" "Coincidental?" Arthur turned to face her, and something in his expression made the doctor take a step back. "My son wasn't breathing for almost a minute. His face was blue. You were debating protocols while his brain was starving for oxygen. And then, this child you're trying to have arrested, did in 5 seconds what none of you could do." He knelt beside Noah, his ruined suit pressing against the wet marble, and lifted his son into his arms with the desperate tenderness of a man who had just visited the edge of an abyss. Noah gurgled and reached for his father's face. Alive, breathing, present. "That's not coincidence," Arthur said quietly. "That's a miracle. And I won't let you arrest the subscribe, because the ending will change the way you look at everyone you pass on the street." The guards released Leo. He stumbled slightly as their support disappeared, his legs unsteady from adrenaline and exhaustion and the simple shock of not being dragged away in handcuffs. He caught himself before he fell, pride refusing to let him collapse in front of all these people who had been ready to treat him like a criminal seconds ago. Arthur stood, Noah cradled against his chest, and walked toward Leo. The crowd parted for him. Of course it did. Money had gravity, and Arthur Vance was a financial black hole around which lesser bodies had no choice but to orbit. Doctors, nurses, security guards, wealthy patients who had gathered to watch the drama unfold, they all stepped aside as the billionaire approached the homeless boy. Leo didn't step back. He'd learned long ago that showing fear invited predators. And despite everything that had just happened, his survival instincts were still screaming that this man was dangerous. Not physically dangerous, Arthur Vance had probably never thrown a punch in his life, but dangerous in the way that powerful people were always dangerous to powerless ones. One word from this man could destroy Leo's life even further. Could have him arrested, institutionalized, removed from the streets he'd learned to navigate, and placed in a system that would be infinitely worse. But Leo didn't step back. He met Arthur's eyes and waited. For a long moment, the two of them just looked at each other. The billionaire in his ruined designer suit, holding a baby who was alive because of a street kid's intervention. The homeless boy in his dirty hoodie, purple cup still clutched in his hand, duct tape visible on sneakers that had walked 1,000 miles of hard concrete. Two worlds that had never been meant to intersect, colliding in a hospital lobby over a shared miracle. "What's your name?" Arthur asked. "Leo." "Leo what?" Leo hesitated. His last name carried weight he didn't want to share with strangers, connections to a mother who had disappeared, a father who had never existed, a history of foster homes and shelters and caseworkers who had given up on him years ago. Just Leo. Arthur nodded slowly, accepting this. Just Leo. "How old are you?" 12. Something flickered across Arthur's face. Pain, maybe. Or recognition. His own son was 7 months old. This boy was only 11.5 years away from being the same age as Leo. The gap between them suddenly seemed both infinite and terrifyingly small. "How did you know what to do?" Arthur's voice had softened now, losing the commanding edge that had cowed the security guards. "How did you know the water would work?" Leo shrugged, the gesture awkward and defensive. "Seen it before. In the shelters. Babies lock up sometimes when they get scared. Body forgets how to breathe. Cold water resets things, like rebooting a computer." "You learned this in a homeless shelter?" "Learned a lot of things in shelters." Arthur absorbed this. Behind him, Dr. Okonkwo was conferring with the other physicians in hushed, urgent tones. Leo caught fragments of their conversation. Mammalian dive reflex. Vagal response. Cold water triggering autonomic reset. Medical terminology that probably meant they were trying to explain what had happened in ways that fit their training. Let them explain it however they wanted. Leo knew the truth. Mrs. Patterson had known the truth. Sometimes the people with the least education had the most wisdom, because wisdom came from living, not from books. "You were outside," Arthur said. It wasn't a question. "By the entrance. I saw you when we came in. You were standing by the pillar." Leo tensed. Here it came. The accusation. The assumption that he'd been planning to steal something, case the building, find a way to take advantage of the wealthy patients who came and went. "I was cold," Leo said flatly. "The heat from the doors. I wasn't trying to." "I know." Arthur cut him off gently. "I know you weren't trying to do anything wrong. You were just trying to stay warm." The words hit Leo harder than any accusation could have. He was used to being suspected, watched, accused. He wasn't used to being understood. "You saw Noah stop breathing," Arthur continued. "You saw the doctors standing around doing nothing. You could have stayed hidden, could have stayed safe, could have watched it happen, and walked away." "No." The word came out before Leo could stop it, fierce and certain. "No, I couldn't." "Why not?" Leo thought about the question. Really thought about it. Because something in Arthur's tone suggested he genuinely wanted to know, not as an interrogation, but as a genuine attempt to understand. "Because I know what it's like," Leo finally said. "To need help and not get it. To be invisible. To have people look right through you like you don't exist." He glanced at Noah. At the baby's peaceful face, now pressed against his father's chest. "He's just a baby. He didn't do anything wrong. He didn't deserve to die just because the doctors were too scared to act." "Too scared?" "Of you." Leo met Arthur's eyes again. "They were scared of you, of making a mistake on a rich man's kid, so scared of doing the wrong thing that they couldn't do anything at all." The truth hung in the air between them, uncomfortable and undeniable. Arthur wanted to argue. Leo could see it in the tension of his jaw, the slight narrowing of his eyes. Rich people didn't like being told that their wealth was a problem. They liked to believe their money only opened doors, never closed them. But Arthur didn't argue. Instead, he looked down at Noah, at the baby who was alive because a homeless boy had been brave enough to ignore the fear that had paralyzed 17 trained professionals. "You're right," Arthur said quietly. "They were scared of me, and my son almost died because of it." He looked back at Leo, and something had changed in his expression. The calculation was still there. Arthur Vance hadn't built an empire by being naive, but beneath it was something else. Something that looked almost like respect. "Thank you, Leo, for saving my son." Leo didn't know what to say. In 12 years of life, no one with power had ever thanked him for anything. He'd been tolerated, ignored, dismissed, occasionally helped by social workers who meant well, but couldn't do enough. But thanked? By a billionaire? In front of a crowd of wealthy witnesses? This wasn't how the world worked. This wasn't how anything worked. "I should go," Leo mumbled, suddenly desperate to escape the attention, the gratitude, the weight of being seen. "I should." "Wait." Arthur's hand came up. Not grabbing, just requesting. "Please, wait." Leo stopped. Arthur studied him for a long moment. The dirty hoodie, the torn jeans, the duct tape on the sneakers, the soot on his cheek. All the markers of poverty that made Leo invisible to people like Arthur Vance. All the details that said this boy didn't belong here, didn't matter here, wasn't worth the attention of anyone important. Then Arthur did something that shocked everyone in the lobby. He knelt down. Not a slight bend, not a polite lowering, a full kneel. His expensive pants pressing into the wet marble, bringing his eyes level with Leo's. The same position he'd taken to beg for his son's life. The same position of vulnerability and desperation. Except now it was a position of equals. "I see you," Arthur said quietly. "I see you, Leo. And I want you to know that what you did matters. You matter. Not because you saved my son, although I will be grateful for that until the day I die, but because you chose to act when everyone else chose to freeze. That takes courage. That takes character. That takes something that money can't buy and schools can't teach." Leo felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He blinked them back furiously. He hadn't cried in years. Crying was weakness, and weakness got you hurt on the streets. But Arthur's words had found something buried deep inside him, something he'd thought was dead. A small, desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might actually see him as more than a problem to be solved. "I don't want your money," Leo said, his voice rough. "I didn't do it for money." "I know." Arthur smiled, and for the first time it reached his eyes. "That's exactly why I want to give you something else." "What?" Arthur reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card. It was simple, elegant, expensive, thick cardstock, with raised lettering that probably cost more per card than Leo spent on food in a week. "My personal number," Arthur said, pressing the card into Leo's hand, "and a promise. Whatever you need, school, housing, medical care, a job when you're old enough you call me. Not my assistant, not my secretary, me, and I will make it happen." Leo stared at the card. The letters swam before his eyes, blurring with tears he refused to let fall. "Why?" he whispered. "Because you saved my son's life. Because you showed more courage in 90 seconds than most people show in 90 years. And because—" Arthur paused, his voice catching slightly. "Because you were invisible, and you stepped into the light anyway." He stood, lifting Noah back to his chest, and looked at Leo with something that might have been hope. "Heroes don't always wear capes, Leo. Sometimes they wear dirty hoodies and carry plastic cups, and they deserve a chance to become whoever they're meant to be." Arthur has made Leo a promise, but promises from billionaires don't always mean what they sound like. Will Arthur keep his word? Will Leo finally have a chance at a different life? The final chapter reveals everything, and trust me, you're not ready for it. Subscribe now. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. And I'll see you in next chapter. 3 weeks later, Leo stood in a place he never thought he'd be. A courtroom. Not the kind of courtroom he'd always feared. The cold, institutional spaces where kids like him got sentenced to juvenile detention or shuffled into foster systems that chewed them up and spit them out. This courtroom was different. Wood-paneled walls, leather chairs, a judge who smiled when she looked at him instead of frowning. This was family court, and Leo was here because Arthur Vance had kept his promise. The billionaire sat 3 rows behind Leo, Noah gurgling happily in his arms. Beside Arthur was his wife, Celeste, a woman Leo had met only twice, but who had hugged him both times, like he was already family. She was crying now soft, happy tears that she kept wiping away with the tissue that probably cost more than Leo's entire outfit. Not that his outfit was cheap anymore. Leo looked down at himself, still not quite believing what he saw. New jeans that actually fit. A button-down shirt that had never been worn by anyone else. Shoes, real shoes, with no duct tape, no holes, no memories of miles walked on frozen concrete. He felt like a stranger in his own body. Leo Marcus Wellington, the judge said, reading from the papers in front of her. Age 12. Ward of the state of Illinois for the past 4 years. Previously placed in 7 foster homes, all of which were terminated due to circumstances beyond the child's control. Leo flinched at the recitation of his history. 7 foster homes, each one a promise that had turned into a lie. Each one a family that had looked at him and eventually decided he wasn't worth the trouble. Too angry, too quiet, too traumatized, too black, too broken. The excuses varied, but the result was always the same. Back to the group home, back to the shelter system, back to the streets, where at least the rejection was honest. However, the judge continued, and something in her voice made Leo look up. I have before me a petition for legal guardianship filed by Arthur and Celeste Vance, requesting permanent custody of the minor child. Leo's heart stopped. He'd known this was coming. Arthur had explained it to him, carefully and patiently, over the course of several conversations. Had made sure Leo understood that this wasn't charity, wasn't pity, wasn't some rich man's attempt to feel good about himself. You saved my son, Arthur had said, sitting across from Leo in a coffee shop that served drinks costing more than Leo used to spend on food in a week. But that's not why I want to do this. I want to do this because you deserve a chance, a real chance, and because he'd paused, struggling with words that didn't come easily to a man who usually bought his way through obstacles. Because I see something in you, Leo. Something that reminds me of myself, a long time ago, before I had money, before I had power, when I was just a kid, trying to survive a world that didn't want me. Leo hadn't known what to say, hadn't known how to process the idea that someone like Arthur Vance had ever been anything like him. But he'd said yes, not because he believed it would work, not because he trusted that this time would be different from all the other times, but because Noah's face kept appearing in his dreams, blue and still, and dying, and then gasping back to life. Because that moment in the hospital lobby had cracked something open inside Leo. Something that had been sealed shut for years. Hope. That's what stopped listening. His attention had drifted to the window, to the Chicago skyline visible through the glass. Somewhere out there was the shelter where he'd spent his last night before Arthur's people had found him and brought him somewhere warm. Somewhere out there was the Mercy One Medical Center, where a purple plastic cup had changed the course of 2 lives. Somewhere out there was the version of himself that had existed 3 weeks ago. The invisible boy, the survivor. The kid with duct tape on his shoes and soot on his cheek, and absolutely no reason to believe that anything would ever get better. That boy felt like a stranger now. Not because Leo had changed, not really. Not in the ways that mattered. He was still the same person who had learned to count exits and hoard food and sleep with one eye open. Those instincts didn't disappear just because someone handed you new clothes and a hot meal. But something else had shifted. Something internal. A small, fragile belief that maybe, just maybe, the world contained more than pain. Leo? He blinked. The judge was looking at him expectantly. So was Arthur. So was Celeste. So was the social worker and the lawyer and everyone else in the courtroom. I'm sorry, Leo said. I wasn't. What did you say? The judge smiled. It was a kind smile, the kind that reached her eyes, the kind that Leo had learned to distrust because it usually preceded disappointment. I asked if you understand what's happening today, if you consent to the Vances becoming your legal guardians. Leo looked at Arthur, the billionaire who had knelt on a wet marble floor to meet his eyes, who had seen the duct tape on his shoes and the soot on his cheek and decided that those things didn't define him, who had promised him a future and then actually delivered. He looked at Celeste, the woman who had cried when she heard Leo's story, who had insisted on meeting him before the legal process began, not to evaluate him like the foster families had, but to hug him and tell him that he was brave and that she was honored to have him join their family. He looked at Noah, the baby in the red onesie, now wearing a blue one, because babies apparently needed different colored onesies for different days. The baby who was alive because Leo had ignored his own safety and done what needed to be done. The baby who reached toward Leo every time he saw him, chubby fingers grasping, mouth forming sounds that weren't quite words but felt like recognition. A brother. Leo was going to have a brother. The thought hit him like a wave, overwhelming and terrifying and wonderful all at once. He'd never had siblings. Never had family, not really. Not since his mother disappeared and the system swallowed him whole. But now he was going to have a brother. A baby brother who would grow up knowing Leo's name, learning from Leo's example, looking up to Leo, the way Leo had never had anyone to look up to. The responsibility was enormous. The opportunity was even bigger. Yes, Leo said, his voice steady despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. I consent. The judge nodded, satisfied. She picked up her gavel, an actual gavel, like something from a movie, and raised it above the wooden block on her desk. Then, by the power vested in me by the state of Illinois, I hereby grant legal guardianship of Leo Marcus Wellington to Arthur and Celeste Vance, effective immediately. The gavel came down, and just like that, Leo had a family. The celebration that followed was unlike anything Leo had ever experienced. Arthur had rented out an entire restaurant for the occasion, a place with white tablecloths and candles and waiters who called Leo Sir without any trace of irony. There was food Leo had never seen before, dishes with names he couldn't pronounce, flavors that made his taste buds wonder what they'd been doing all these years settling for convenience store snacks and shelter cafeteria meals. But the food wasn't what mattered. What mattered was the people, Arthur's business associates, who shook Leo's hand and told him they'd heard about what he did at the hospital. Celeste's family, who flew in from 3 different states to meet the boy who had saved their nephew's life. Noah's nanny, a warm Jamaican woman named Rosalind, who had taken one look at Leo and declared that he needed feeding up, and immediately started piling his plate with extra portions. What mattered was belonging. For the first time in Leo's memory, he wasn't on the outside looking in. He wasn't the invisible boy, the inconvenient child, the problem to be solved or ignored. He was part of something. A family. A community. A future. It was terrifying. It was wonderful. It was so much that Leo had to excuse himself halfway through dinner, retreating to the bathroom just to breathe, just to process, just to let the tears fall that he'd been holding back for hours. That's where Arthur found him. The billionaire slipped into the bathroom quietly, closing the door behind him, giving Leo the privacy to wipe his face and pretend he hadn't been crying. Too much? Arthur asked gently. Leo nodded, not trusting his voice. I understand. Arthur leaned against the sink, his posture casual, non-threatening. When I made my first million, I locked myself in my office for 3 hours because I didn't know how to process it. When I made my first billion, I almost had a panic attack. Change is hard, even when it's good change, especially when it's good change. I don't know how to do this, Leo admitted. How to be part of something. I've always been alone. I've always had to take care of myself. I don't know how to let someone else take care of me. You don't have to figure it out all at once. Arthur moved closer, placing a hand on Leo's shoulder. We're going to take this slow, give you space when you need it. Support when you want it. And patience, lots of patience, while you figure out what this new life looks like. What if I mess up? The fear that had been lurking beneath Leo's hope finally surfaced. What if I do something wrong? What if you decide I'm too much trouble and… Leo. Arthur's voice was firm but kind. Nothing you do will make us send you away. Nothing. You're family now, and family doesn't give up on each other. The other families did. The foster families. They all gave up eventually. They weren't your family. They were strangers who signed paperwork. We're different. Arthur knelt down, just like he had in the hospital lobby, bringing his eyes level with Leo's. You saved my son's life. You stepped out of the shadows when you had every reason to stay hidden. You risked everything for a baby you'd never met, from a family that had never seen you. He took Leo's hands in his own. That's not the action of someone who gives up. That's the action of someone with more courage than most adults I know, more character, more heart. He squeezed Leo's hands. I'm not worried about you messing up. I'm excited to watch you succeed. Leo stared at the man who had gone from stranger to guardian in the span of 3 weeks. The man who saw him. Really saw him. Thank you, Leo whispered. For everything. Thank you, Arthur replied. For saving Noah. For giving me a chance to be something more than a billionaire. For letting me be a father to both my sons. Both my sons. The words wrapped around Leo like a blanket, warm and protective and safe. He hadn't had a father in so long that he'd forgotten what the word meant. What it felt like to have someone claim you, choose you, fight for you. Now he knew, and he was never going to forget. 6 months later, Leo stood in front of Mercy One Medical Center. The building looked different now. Not physically, it was still the same glass tower, the same marble lobby, the same crystal chandelier, scattering light across floors that cost more than most people's houses. But Leo saw it differently. 6 months ago, this had been enemy territory, a place where people like him weren't welcome, weren't wanted, weren't even visible. A monument to wealth and privilege that existed in a completely different dimension from the streets he'd walked. Now it was just a building. Important? Yes. Impressive? Certainly. But not intimidating. Not anymore. Because Leo had learned something in the past 6 months. Something that Arthur had tried to tell him but that he'd had to figure out for himself. Buildings didn't have power. Money didn't have power. Marble floors and crystal chandeliers and designer suits. None of it had real power. People had power. Courage had power. The willingness to act when everyone else froze that had power. And Leo had more of that power than he'd ever realized. He was here today for a ceremony. Arthur had donated $10 million to establish a new wing of the hospital, a pediatric emergency center that would be free for families who couldn't afford care. State-of-the-art equipment, world-class doctors, and a policy that explicitly forbade the kind of protocol paralysis that had almost killed Noah. The wing was called the Leo Wellington Center for Emergency Pediatric Care. His name, on a building. A permanent reminder that heroes didn't always wear capes. Sometimes they wore dirty hoodies and carried plastic cups. Leo walked through the revolving doors into the lobby where everything had changed. Arthur and Celeste were already there, Noah bouncing in his mother's arms, pointing at the chandelier and babbling with the enthusiasm of a 1-year-old discovering the world. The crowd parted as Leo approached. Not because they were afraid of him, those days were over, but because they respected him, admired him, saw him. Arthur put his arm around Leo's shoulders as they walked toward the stage where the ribbon cutting would take place. Nervous? Arthur asked. A little, Leo admitted. I still don't understand why anyone would name a building after me. I just poured water on a baby. Arthur laughed. You did a lot more than that, son. You reminded all of us, the doctors, the staff, me, what really matters. Not protocols, not liability, not the fear of making mistakes. Just the courage to act when someone needs help. They reached the stage. A podium had been set up, microphones arranged, cameras positioned to capture the moment. Reporters from every major news outlet waited with their recorders and notebooks. ready to tell the story of the homeless boy who had saved a billionaire's baby and been adopted into his family. It was a good story, a viral story, the kind of story that made people feel hopeful about humanity. But Leo knew the truth was more complicated than any headline could capture. The truth was that he still woke up some nights in a cold sweat, dreaming about shelters and streets and the bone-deep certainty that everything good would eventually be taken away. The truth was that he still hoarded food in his bedroom sometimes, hiding granola bars and crackers in places where no one would think to look, just in case. The truth was that he was still learning how to be part of a family, how to trust, how to let people love him without waiting for the other shoe to drop. But the truth was also that he was getting better, day by day, week by week, with every meal at the big dining room table, every game night with Arthur and Celeste, every moment spent making Noah laugh. He was healing. And that was enough. That was more than enough. Arthur stepped up to the podium and began his speech. Leo only half listened, his attention drawn to the crowd, to the faces watching him with curiosity and admiration. Among them, he spotted a boy about his age. Dirty clothes, worn shoes, the look of someone who had wandered in from the cold, hoping to steal a moment of warmth. The boy caught Leo's eye. For a moment, they just looked at each other, two versions of the same person, separated by 6 months, and one act of impossible courage. Leo smiled, reached into his pocket, pulled out a business card, his own card now, with his name and Arthur's contact information. He walked over to the boy, ignoring the cameras, ignoring the ceremony, ignoring everything except this one important moment. "I'm Leo," he said, extending the card. "I used to be where you are. If you ever need help, food, shelter, anything, you call this number. Someone will answer, I promise." The boy stared at the card, at Leo, at the impossible reality of someone actually seeing him. "Why?" the boy whispered. Leo thought about the question, about Mrs. Patterson and her wisdom, about Arthur and his promise, about Noah and the purple cup, and the moment when everything changed. "Because someone helped me when I needed it," Leo said, "and now it's my turn to help someone else. That's how it works. That's how we change the world, one person at a time." The boy took the card. His hands were shaking. "Thank you," he breathed. "Don't thank me yet," Leo grinned. "Thank me when your life looks completely different than it does right now. Because it will. I promise." He turned back toward the stage, toward his family, toward the future he never could have imagined 3 weeks ago when he was just a homeless boy stealing warmth from a hospital's revolving doors. Arthur was watching him with pride. Celeste was wiping away tears. Noah was reaching toward Leo, babbling his brother's name in baby speak. Leo Wellington, formerly homeless, formerly invisible, formerly forgotten, walked toward them with his head held high. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear dirty hoodies. Sometimes they carry plastic cups. And sometimes they're 12-year-old boys who refuse to let the world tell them they don't matter. This is the end of Leo's story, but it doesn't have to be the end of yours. Every view, every share, every comment helps this message reach someone who needs to hear it, someone who feels invisible, someone who's waiting for permission to be brave. If this story moved you, do 3 things for me. Subscribe to this channel, share this video with someone who needs hope, and leave a comment telling me, what act of courage have you been too afraid to take? Because somewhere out there, there's a baby who needs saving, a moment that needs a hero. And the only thing standing between tragedy and miracle is someone brave enough to act. That someone could be you. Until next time, stay brave, stay visible, and never forget that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear your shoes.